Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 433. And this time, we're actually going to be talking about some death metal. That's right, it's the first time in over a month that we aren't talking about Slavic black metal. Sometimes you gotta vary stuff up a little bit, but this one actually comes from a viewer suggestion in the comments, which normally, I'll read through them, and if it seems like a good idea, I'll be like, yeah, I may possibly at some point in the future create that episode, when I get around to it, YouTube. But this suggestion of the classic Swedish death metal band God Macabre actually kind of dovetailed with where the flow state of my brain was at the time. You see, back at the beginning of May, I did a collaboration video with Quest for Metal, all about Slavic metal. You should go and check that video out, by the way. It was pretty sick. But this nice British fella had reached out to me and said, hey, I did stuff with The Dog and Jimmy from the Block. You want to do some kind of collaboration video? You get to pick the topic. And I was like, sure. And so I started thinking about topics related to metal, and I was shooting for something where I felt like I could really add something to the conversation, like something I knew a lot about that I knew a lot of other people didn't know as much about said topic. And I landed on Slavic black metal because when it comes to black metal from the Slavic countries, especially the Ukrainian and the Russian stuff, I haven't met anyone else out there that's as nuts about that kind of shit as I am. I mean, you've seen all those Blazebirth Hall episodes, right? But that got me to thinking, are there any other topics within the overall metal universe that I feel like I'm particularly knowledgeable about? And I ended up hitting on Swedish death metal. Why don't you just kill yourself? And I'm not talking about Aeon or Soils of Fate or Deranged. That's death metal from Sweden, but it's not Swedish death metal, okay? Swedish death metal is its own very special thing. It's kind of its own genre. It's got a very peculiar way of playing the guitar, not just the overdriven HM2 distortion, but the way you play guitar in Swedish death metal is different than how you play it in normal death metal. It's got a different style of drumming. It's got a different style of vocals. And I'm not talking about the Gothenburg stuff either. I mean, obviously, I'm into that too. That 3-part In Flames episode I did a while back. I guess what I call Swedish death metal, some people would call the Stockholm sound, even though a lot of the foundational bands, while they might have recorded at Studio Sunlight in Stockholm, they're not from Stockholm. Grave is from Gotland, Sorcery is from Sandviken, Nirvana 2002 is from Edsbyn, Obscurity is from Malmö, etc., etc. In fact, the very first Swedish death metal album isn't even from Sweden. It's Autopsy's Severed Survival.
그러니까 엄마 아빠가 그거를 해주면 이게 하드렌즈니까.
Yeah, that's right, I said it. Swedish death metal invented in California in the 80s. My evidence for this claim. What the fuck else do you call this? If not Swedish death metal. Honorable mention for proto-Swedish death metal goes to the great band Slaughter from Canada. So yeah, the band we're going to be talking about this time around, God Macabre, one of the best examples of this particular micro-genre. And I actually was lucky enough to get into them in a very old school way many, many years ago. I first heard them on the Pantalgia International Death Metal compilation from 1992, which is probably how a lot of people got exposed to them. At the time, I was just buying anything that looked like old school death metal, thought the comp cover looked sick, picked it up for like $5. It had probably been sitting in that record store for like a decade and a half, and it introduced me to a whole bunch of sick bands that I still regularly listen to this day. Stuff like Malediction, Cenotaph from Mexico, Disembowelment, Rotravor, Crematory from Sweden, Cadaver, and the lead-off track on this compilation was God Macabre's Ashes of Morning Life. So that seems a good place to start as any, because this is some absolutely textbook Swedish death metal. Not only does it have that overdriven, buzzing HM2 guitar tone, it also showcases one of the songwriting elements that most endeared me to Swedish death metal back in the day, that being these sort of very elaborate song intros. Then it gets violent. But the way in which it gets violent is very different from your standard death metal band. It doesn't blast, it doesn't have your NYHC style brutal death metal breakdowns. Swedish death metal is way more likely to thrash or grind than it is to blast, which kind of sets it apart from most other death metal, even the more old school stuff. It also tends to have more consonantly melodic and elaborate song structures, like this little bridge right here, which is going to take us into another weird element peculiar to Swedish death metal, that being its incorporation of almost 70s rock style riffs, just heavily death metalified. The lead guitar also shows off a bit of that bluesiness that's endemic to Swedish death metal, but in a way that's like morbid and gross, almost like it's making fun of this kind of stuff. It sounds like it's murdering rock and roll while at the same time taking elements from it. And there's also that dark and mournful feeling going on, which is present in a lot of Swedish death metal. I mean, it's Scandinavia, it's pretty dark in the winter, but God Macabre in particular accentuates that with the way they pick their lead guitar melodies when they're not doing the hard rock blues parody. And speaking of that lead guitar, that might be what God Macabre has over just about every other Swedish death metal band. The lead guitar playing for this rather unknown band shows up entombed. It even rivals a lot of Dismember. It's like the thing that makes God Macabre God Macabre. And because it's Swedish death metal, not only do you have a great intro to the song, you also have a great sort of outro riff section. A lot of people clown on Swedish death metal saying it's simpler than other death metal bands, but that's really only true from a standpoint of technicality. As far as the way that the songs are written goes, they tend to be a lot more complex than other varieties of death metal, and that includes having songs that rarely just loop back around to repeating the intro riff. There's always some sort of denouement section that might harken back to how the song started, but it also introduces new ideas. So these God Macabre guys, archetypal Swedish death metal, and they were always kind of that, but in their early days when they were called Macabre End, they had a slightly different sound compared to what they ended up doing on the full-length album. A sound that often wasn't entirely Swedish to modern eardrums. Witness the title track off of Macabre End's 1990 Consumed by Darkness demo. There's one review for this fucker on Metal Archives, and surprisingly, it's actually one that I agree with, because this fella typed out the same idea that I've always had in my head about this release. It sounds almost more Finnish than Swedish, a lot like those bands Demigod and Adramalag I covered a while back. Like this arpeggiated melody with the droning keyboards in the background sounds super fucking Finnish to my ears. You could probably trick someone into thinking this was a Finnish demo and not a Swedish one. In fact, given how old this demo is, I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually what influenced a lot of the Finnish old school to head in that direction. Less violent than Entombed or Dismember, and more just dark, sinister, occult depravity sort of thing. And that feeling continues on with the other two songs on the demo. Even the guitar sound on this demo is a little bit more Finnish than Swedish. But you could tell this was still engineered by Thomas Skogsberg at Studio Sunlight, particularly when it comes to the drum sound. But the guitar tone, while still being an overdriven HM2 bit of nastiness, is a lot closer to something you might hear from a band like Funebre. And the riffs themselves, they don't bounce so much as they hammer you. Like this whole 3/4 section, were it to be done by another Swedish death metal band, I think it'd have more of a swing to it, more of a groove. Here it seems more serious and malevolent. The lead guitar also has a very mournful Finnish tone to it, but it's still kind of doing that evil blues thing that a lot of the Swedish bands like to do. It's really more during the fast sections that this record sounds more endemically Swedish. Like this right here, this feels like the old Swedish death metal to me. And like a lot of the old Swedish death metal bands, there's some grind to it. Here's some Mick Harris shit. Very brutal, primitive, and fast. And it contrasts nicely with the doomy sections. The war between the contrasting grind and doom elements was always a big thing for Swedish death metal in general, but for God Macabre, or in this case Macabre End, same band pretty much, it was like a defining element of their sound, juxtaposing this sort of old school British grindcore thing with the doomier, more consonantly melodic sections. So that Macabre End demo, probably the best Swedish piece of Finnish death metal of all time. Then they changed their name to God Macabre, and they become a lot more Swedish sounding. A lot of people accuse all of these Swedish death metal bands of sounding the same. You know, like, oh, Dismembered and Entombed, it sounds like the same band. This is a stupid thing to do. This is you when you say stuff like that. Because it means you're not looking at the genre holistically. Like I said earlier, Swedish death metal, yeah, it's got death metal in the name, but it's pretty much its own subgenre of metal. Like Grave and Unleashed, they sound more like each other than either of them sound like Morbid Angel, sure. That doesn't mean that they're clones of each other. They're playing in the same genre. It'd be like saying Electric Wizard and Sleep are clones of each other. In the case of God Macabre, them becoming more of a Swedish death metal band doesn't mean they sound exactly like Entombed or Dismember or Nirvana 2002. It really means that they are upping the Autopsy influence considerably, and they're doing so in a pretty interesting way on this release. If you remember that Autopsy track I played earlier, went a little something like, you know, properly Swedish death metal from its original homeland, California. What I didn't mention about that track is immediately after that super Swedish death metal sounding riff, they hit you with something that sounds like some pretty gonzo doomy shit that would evolve into an even stranger sort of thing on the second Autopsy album. We're talking about shit that sounds like full-on psychedelic doom metal reinterpreted through a death metal lens, which is probably why the dog can't really vibe with what's going on in that album. Now, back when they were called Macabre End, this particular Swedish cadre already had that sort of push and pull between the doomy and the grindy going on. On this release, they started working in that very Autopsy-esque, bizarre style of melody to those doomy bits. They also brought in a lot of gothic influence, and I'm not talking typo negative here. I mean Paradise Lost's Gothic and its immediate predecessor, Lost Paradise. These albums had a considerable influence on the middle era of Swedish death metal, particularly noticeable on Gorment's The Ending Quest, but also very much a part of God Macabre's sound. We're talking about shit like so you take that sort of hyper-melodic, hyper-sorrowful British doom death atmosphere and you apply it to the strange way that Autopsy crafts doom metal sections, and then you work that whole idea into what Macabre End / God Macabre were already doing back in their demo days, you get one of the greatest opening tracks to a Swedish death metal album of all time. We're talking about the opening salvo of God Macabre's The Winter Long, Into Nowhere. I hope you can hear what I'm getting at. This is like an Autopsy doom riff, but with the atmosphere of a Paradise Lost song. And that atmosphere doubles up once the lead guitar overlay comes in, playing a melody that's very Autopsy-ish, but in a very Paradise Lost sort of way. Then the transition into the brutality is just vintage Swedish shit. Fucking awesome. You got D-beat drums, you got this spastic lead guitar going all over the place. And the guitar underneath it is just proper Swedish death metal. Almost like a punk grind sort of riff, but with a lot of Autopsy to it. Then a bit of a transition riff, and some very Swedish death metal vocals. And you got this riff that is Swedish in that it's just very bouncy, but it also has this like train going off the rails type effect. It's like you got this big-ass Mad Max truck with all these spikes and shit falling off and it's just running shit over and things are blowing up. That's what this kind of stuff feels like to me. And it's also super fucking catchy, which is another thing that really sets Swedish death metal apart from other types of death metal. It probably helps I've been listening to this now for 20 years, but I could play pretty much the whole thing inside my head. And then here we go. More of that Paradise Lost sort of atmosphere coming in. The Mellotron in the background. These doomy cinder block falling on your head type riffs. And that all-important lead guitar. The God Macabre signature lead guitar playing style. It goes from doomy into spastic sort of shredding type shit effortlessly. And it does it better than just about every other Swedish death metal band. And then the way that this song ends is just pure Swedish death metal in that it's got its own dedicated outro section. Whole new set of riffs, completely different beast than a lot of what was going on with the rest of the song, while at the same time still very much fitting into the overall song narrative. That's proper, simply played, but complexly written Swedish death metal type shit. And that's why The Winterlong is just such a great fucking old school Swedish death metal album with its own unique twist to it in the form of the even heavier than other Swedish death metal bands level of Autopsy influence combined with that very gothic depressive feeling. And like Paradise Lost Gothic album, there's some instrumental tracks on this release that lean even more heavily into the melody and are themselves some of the album's high points. This particular instrumental track entitled Teardrops, much like with the case of Uncanny Splenium for Nyctophobia with the instrumental track Timeless. This was what initially really grabbed me about this album, and it was my favorite song on this release for quite a while. That position has since been usurped by the opening track and one of the tracks we're going to get to in a bit, but it's still like some of the best shit ever. It's an instrumental, mournful, doomy, almost melodeath sort of track that has a real sense of narrative motion to it. Very defined sections. And a hell of an outro section where they bring back in that double bass. They got that very Autopsy-esque layered melody. And then, because it's God Macabre, some of the best lead guitar in all of Swedish death metal. I know I say this a lot, but if you can't vibe with that shit,
go to the ear, nose, and throat department. Get your hearing checked.
And I definitely don't want to hear you telling me how great Dying Fetus or Cannibal Corpse is. Y'all got bugs in your ears or some shit, man. Tied for the title of my favorite song off of this album with the opener Into Nowhere is the closer, In Grief. This one leans very heavily on that doom metal element and incorporates some of the songwriting strains from the instrumental, more melodic tracks. Despite that, it's still got that classic thrashing brutality to it. You know, don't get it twisted. This is still death fucking metal. It's just death metal done in a more erudite, elevated sort of way, which means that we're going to get a whole lot of different song sections with a lot of twists and turns. I mean, this is the longest song on the album, and it's the closer where they pull out all the stops to give you a very cinematic sort of death metal, doomy Swedish experience. It's Ingmar Bergman, but less Roger Ebert sniffing his own farts and more Jonas Stallhammer hitting you with the fucking Jonas Stallhammer. Boom, bitch, lead guitar. The best solo on the album. You hearing this weird like flowing shit? It's fucking dang. And then this more brutal section coming up, really spastic both in the guitar and drum department. I don't know if Niklas Nilsson even drummed on anything else besides God Macabre, and if that's the case, it's a damn shame because he was awesome. And then this song's outro section, which as we've now established is very important for Swedish death metal, leans into the very gothic elements of this album's two instrumental tracks, bringing in some keyboards, not just that piano bit, but now we're hitting some fucking mellotron. We're doing the first King Crimson album, but it's on a fucking death metal album, and it's done super, super well. Absolutely a bona fide 100% buy or die classic, which you can now do, because originally this shit came out on like MBR Records, the same people that put out the Pentalgia compilation. That shit was fucking out of print forever. Then of all labels, Relapse reissued this back in 2002 before anyone was even getting back into Swedish death metal. And even that reissue was expensive for a long ass time. But then in 2014, Relapse reissued it again. And so now you got all the God Macabre in one place. I just wish there was more of it. But there kind of is more of it because I guess there was one unrecorded song from that era. It's entitled Life's Verge, and in 2014 they decided, fuck it, we already know how it goes, let's just play it. And they did a fucking sick job with that too. It sounds like we're for real back in the 90s in the best way possible. In fact, this might be the best we're back of all the old school Swedish death metal bands, aside from Uncanny. And in the case of both of these bands, I wish they'd recorded more, because I could have used the whole album at this level of fucking old school Swedish death metal goodness. Like this fucking transition riff right here. fucking spectacular. And the vocals, it's the same guy from back in the day, and he almost sounds better, meaner, more pissed off. I guess from dealing with whatever the fuck bullshit was going on in Sweden for the 20 years between the original album's release and this reunion. At least stuff's better now, guys, right?
No, it's not.
Yeah, death metal is one of my few sources of solace in this world of dumb bullshit. Speaking of which, we also got the gothic elements. Okay, that shit didn't go away. We still got the dope fucking doomy shit. I don't know why I'm saying we still got. Like I said, this song was written back in fucking 94. It just wasn't recorded until 2013. And as such, it is in fact some badass Swedish fucking death metal. With the requisite badass Swedish death metal outro section, with its own set of badass Swedish death metal riffs that harken back to themes introduced earlier in the song, and there's the badass lead guitar. Whole thing's fucking sick, and it's because of songs like this that Swedish death metal is one of the things that I'm so passionate about, and one of the aspects of metal that I've become so knowledgeable about over the years. And I felt like changing it up this time around, you know, okay, do some death metal, can't all be fucking... Despite what you may have been led to believe, I do listen to other stuff than just that. And hopefully, over the course of this episode, I have convinced you to do the same and check out some God Macabre. Thanks again for the suggestion. But hey, even if you hated it, thanks for listening or watching, whatever the fuck you did, and I'll see you next time.
God damn it!